In this unit, we're going to begin our discussion of security. So what I did is I divided this unit into two distinct categories. So first, we're going to talk about an introduction to general security concepts, so IT security in general. I won't talk specifically about the cloud. And then I'm going to give you a brief introduction to cloud security, so how we deal with security specifically in the cloud and some of the concerns with the cloud. So I'm not going to get into too much detail on cloud security because we're going to cover that in 4 more sections of the course. So we have 4 more sections, 4 more units uh, that we're going to dedicate towards cloud security. And I'll talk more about why this is, why we spend so much time talking about this and why it's important. So, but we'll get to that later. So for right now, let's start with some of the, exactly what security is. So we're going to start with some basic concepts about security. So basically, what is security? If we were in a classroom and I asked the class, what is security? I always get lots of different interesting answers. But just a real kind of quick elevator pitch, it's protection from adversaries, right? That's basically what security is. Somebody's trying to harm us, we use security to prevent that from happening. And that could be economic harm, it could be physical harm, but either way, it's security that we, are the techniques that we use to help prevent that. So IT security, and by the way, the term security applies to almost every realm, right? Not just IT. But in IT security, we're talking specifically about the protection of information and its critical elements, including systems and hardware, and specifically systems and hardware that store, transmit, and use information. So when I talk about IT security, that's the way I always try to frame it, is I'm worrying about anything that has anything to do with storing, transmitting, and using information. So anything that affects any of those things, I would say is covered by IT security. One of the frequent terms you'll hear in IT security, or a frequent acronym I should say, is the CIA. And of course, I'm not talking about the Central Intelligence Agency here. CIA stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So CIA is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality is basically referring to the secrecy of data, that certain data should be kept secret, and we should have mechanisms that enable that to happen so we don't, people aren't getting information they shouldn't have. Integrity is making sure that it is not adulterated, that somebody can't change that data or make that data incorrect or something like that. And then availability is being able to have access to information and being able to do our jobs in an efficient way. So that's the base, that's the foundation upon which IT security rests. And in order to get to that goal of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, there are 3 pillars of IT security, which is computer security, data security, and network security. So we use those 3 to try to ensure that we have that confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So those are our technical controls. So our technical controls lie in computer security, data security, and network security. And in fact, if you look at a lot of IT security teams, you'll usually have groups of people. If you have a large IT security team, you'll have groups of people that kind of fall into one of those 3 pillars. You'll have people who specialize in the network security, people who specialize in data security, and people who specialize in computer and application security. And then upon that, so basically what creates the technical controls in those 3 pillars are our policies. So we develop IT security policy that we then use technical controls, which are in those 3 pillars, to ensure confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So it starts with the policies. The policies are how we derive our technical controls. We never implement technical controls that don't have some kind of backing of policy. And how do we get those policies? Those policies happen through information security and through governance. So information security and governance is how we. So information security is how we are the standards and the standards and frameworks we use to develop policy, which we then use technical controls. And governance is our enforcement and our management of those policies. So this is all the combination of all of these things you see here is basically IT security. So when you look at an IT security department or how IT security works, this is what we're talking about. Most important thing to take away from this is the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. If you remember those 3 things, then you'll have the basics of IT security down. And I always say it's important to remember all three of them, because some people just think about confidentiality. Some people just think about integrity. Most people forget about availability. So it's important to bear in mind all three of those. All three of them are just as important. So some of the vernacular that you'll hear in IT security, and you'll see throughout the rest of this course, we talk about access, assets, which are, by the way, assets can be more than just physical systems and computers and things like that. Our data and information is also assets. Our intellectual property are assets. Attacks are when people try to gain access or try to affect those assets. Either they try to steal them or they try to impair them, or and so forth and so on. We have controls, safeguards, and countermeasures, which we use to try to protect ourselves. Exploits are vulnerabilities that are taken advantage of by attackers, and we'll talk more about those later on as well. And those exploits they happen because of our exposure from lack of protections, lack of patches, not having antivirus, things like that. So an exposure is just any vulnerability that we have. A loss is when somebody actually is able to get that data or is able to impact our operations. Our security posture is our overall position with respect to IT security. Different organizations have different security postures. Sometimes we adopt different security postures based on our organizations and what type of organization we are. We're going to talk more about risk as well, so we'll discuss risk and how we assess risk. Subjects and objects are basically when we talk about IT security, so subjects and objects are the data that we're trying to secure, and also the tools that we're trying to use to secure it, and the people that are trying to get access to that. So that's a combination of subjects and objects. And then threats and threat agents are basically all those things that could impact our availability, confidentiality, and integrity. And they don't have to be. Threats aren't just people and hackers and attackers and things like that they talk about. Threats can also be natural disasters and things like that. So in IT security, we're just as worried about natural threats as we are against the human factors. They're all just as important in IT security. A lot of people don't really think of it that way. When people think of IT security, think of the good guys and the bad guys, right? The black hats, the white hats, and the coders and all that stuff. So, but threats can come from any direction in addition to all those. So it can also be tornadoes and floods and power outages and all of those things. Because remember, in that first slide that I showed you that looked like the Pantheon, at the bottom we had confidentiality and integrity, but we also had availability. And anything that can affect availability is something that concerns us in IT security. And then we have vulnerabilities, which are basically things that cause exposure. Now, when we talk about data, we're talking about more than just ones and zeros, of course. We're talking about information. Data is just a collection of facts, where information is something that's actionable, something we can use to make decisions. And information is also very valuable to an organization. Probably one of the most valuable assets to many organizations is information, to many organizations rather, especially intellectual property. So some characteristics of information: you have availability. In other words, we're able to use that information when we need it. We're able to access it. We have accuracy, so we can trust that the data is correct. Authenticity. We have confidentiality, meaning that data can be kept confidential or secret if needed, and we have mechanisms in place to do that. Integrity, again, we can trust that data. Utility, it has some use to us. Obviously, there's no point in maintaining data that has very little use. And in fact, that can be counterproductive to keep data that has no use for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about later on. And possession, in other words, who owns the data, who's responsible for the data, or for that information, I should say. So as far as information systems, information systems are designed to manage, process, and store all of this information. And the components of an information system consist of the software, hardware, and data. Those are the three main components that most people think of. These are the technical components of an information system. But information systems can also include the people, the procedures, and as well as the networks. A lot of people forget about the networks. But more so, I think people forget that it's people that have to use that information, that create that information. So they're an important part of an information system, as well as the procedures and standard operating procedures and the policies and so forth and so on. All of that stuff together makes up a complete information system. It's not just the technology. Now, as far as information security and access, I've touched on this a little bit earlier, but one of the um, one of the important things, well, I don't want to say important, but one of the contentious things about IT security, and if any of you work in an organization, you probably have experienced this, that IT security can tend to be at odds sometimes, feels like it's at odds with the overall goals of the organization. Take, for example, this picture here where we're trying to balance security with access. The Chief Information Security Officer is saying that encryption is needed to protect our secrets of the organization, whereas the users are saying, well, encrypted email is a hassle and encrypted email slows me down. I find myself saying this all the time. I say it every day at my job because I have to exchange information with other companies all the time, and everybody uses these encrypted email services. They're all a little bit different. I have to have a desk drawer full of passwords to manage all this stuff, and it's a big pain in the neck. Every time I get an email from somebody that has protected information, I have to go and figure out what the password is, and I got to log in, and there doesn't seem to be a really elegant way to manage encryption on email yet. Hopefully some standard will emerge at some point, but in the meantime, it's a big pain in the neck. But in any event, um, all that stuff is a pain, but it's necessary. But sometimes it feels like it's, kind of a block to me being able to do my job as effectively as I want to. So sometimes, we have to balance. We have to kind of a balancing act between the security and the access. And it can feel a bit contentious at times, but it's also important for folks in the security realm to understand the ramifications of security and to weigh the benefits versus the costs, and to make that determination. And in different organizations, that answer is going to be a little bit different. So one of the things we have to do in IT security is managing risk. I'm going to talk about risk management in the cloud later on. We'll talk about this specifically to the cloud, but for overall risk management, it's good to have at least an understanding of risk management from a high level before we get into the cloud specific issues with risk management, is to understand this process of managing risk. So when you're managing risk, the first step is you need to identify what your risks are. So first, identify your risks. You're going to inventory and categorize all of your assets. That includes physical access, your people, the buildings, and all of those different components that I talked about that make up an information system. All of those components we have to look at and categorize and inventory. We have to figure out what their values are. So you have to try to come up with some value for those assets. Then we have to identify and prioritize the threats to those assets. So what are the assets? What are they worth? And what are the possible threats? And what are the possible vulnerabilities? So what could go wrong? What could cause issues with either the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability? And what is what would happen if any of that happened? So then the risk assessment is where we take all of those categories and the threats and vulnerabilities, and we determine the frequency of a loss for each of those. So we don't just look at the asset, we don't just look at that asset and say, okay, what are the odds of a loss? We figure out what the odds are for each different type of threat and each different type of vulnerability, and we try to codify all of that into some kind of analysis to figure out how often that could happen. We evaluate what the magnitude of those losses would be, right? So if and here's the thing, if I might say that an asset has a certain value, for example, a server, a piece of hardware has a value that's very easy to calculate looking at the hardware, but there's also a value there that is that's maybe not as obvious that we have to consider. So what would the loss of, say, a server for 6 hours that is that's very important to the organization, beyond just the dollar value of that server itself? There could be other factors in there. There could be a loss of revenue, a loss of trust in the industry or with the customers. There could be, other impacts, a loss of customers because they were down. You couldn't, provide certain services and things like that. From our loss frequency and our loss magnitude, from that, we can calculate what the risk is, and we can figure out, how much risk we're willing to accept. And once we understand that, once we understand what the risks are, what the costs are to us, Only then we can figure out how we're going to control those risks. So we have to come up with some kind of control strategy and then justify those controls based on the risk assessment. I'll give you an example. If you live in an apartment or a home, or a dorm or something like that, one of the threats that we have in physical structures is fire and flood, things like that. So, take fire and flood for example. A fire is something that can happen in any structure. In fact, I believe that the odds today of a building catching on fire are once in every 100 years is about the average right now for most structures. Although that's going down considerably because of safety and code and things like that. Fires are becoming more and more rare, thank goodness. But in any event, fires can definitely happen. We can calculate exactly what the risk is of a fire on any given structure. And we can use that risk to decide whether or not we want to accept that risk from that assessment, or we can transfer that risk by getting insurance, for example. And then we can justify, for example, a $300,000 home, you can probably insure against fire for about $1,000 a year. Well, that means that it would take you, if you're spending $1,000 a year, it would take you 300 years to pay for the price of the house in insurance. But if you have a fire anytime in the next 20 years when you're paying that insurance, it's well worth it because you would have only spent $20,000 for that insurance, but you would get back, the ability to rebuild your house. But likewise with flooding, where I live not far from a lake, but the odds of that lake flooding my house are pretty low. And I don't live in a floodplain. So for me to get flood insurance almost seems, crazy for me to pay for insurance for flooding when it's so rare, and that it would ever happen. But if it ever did happen, I could lose my whole house. So that's a kind of an interesting question that I have to ask myself periodically: is it worth it to get flood insurance? There's different types of insurance for water damage that you can get, but flooding means that some body of water, or anything that's a natural source of water has caused damage to your home, and that could be rain falling and collecting and then damaging your home or something like that. But I have to figure out based on how often that risk, or how often, or what the likelihood of that risk is, and what the impact will be, whether or not it makes sense, and I can justify uh, my strategy for controlling that risk. My strategy for controlling the risk of fire doesn't necessarily have to be insurance. I could get a fire suppression system. I could, make sure I follow code to reduce the likelihood of a fire. I could make sure that, and as I say that, I'm glancing over at my electrical box in my home office. But, for flooding, I could take precautions to make sure that I'm not going to be susceptible to floods, make within reason. So there's other types of controls that we can use. So as far as risk analysis goes, basically what we're trying to figure out is what it's going to cost if that risk happens, what the likelihood of that risk is, and how to amortize those costs over time. So these are all kind of accounting terms, right? Amortizing risk and amortizing the costs. Trying to figure out, how we can divide those costs into years, and then what makes sense for us to spend to either transfer or mitigate or control that risk. Um, so as far as managing risk, there's several different approaches that we can use to reduce risk. The one is transference, which is where we make a third party responsible for the risk. When we talk about risk transference, we're basically talking about insurance. So transference is typically making it someone else's problem, right? We're paying somebody else to take responsibility for that risk. So I pay an insurance company for my fire insurance on my home. If it ever burns down, my insurance company is responsible for it, not me. So I'm transferring that risk to someone else. Risk avoidance is identifying the risk and making a decision to not engage in some activity. So, for example, having a trampoline can be a risk. Having a pool can be a risk in your home. People can drown in pools. Children can get badly injured on trampolines. It's not uncommon. So that risk I can avoid by simply not having a pool and not having a trampoline. I can make a decision that, hey, we're not going to have a pool because I don't want to accept that risk of a child being injured in my pool, because it could be dangerous. So I can simply avoid it. And a lot of people don't have pools for that reason. Um, and then mitigation, which is addressing the risk by making it less serious. So we can try to make a risk less serious through mitigation. So that's some basic strategy on managing risk. So now let's change gears and talk about business continuity. So business continuity, and I'm going to talk about two different things here, which are closely related to IT security as we wrap up this IT security concepts lecture here. The last two things we're going to talk about are business continuity and disaster recovery, and a lot of people get those two mixed up. Business continuity is all about having high availability. In other words, systems should not go down because of simple failures or common failures. Disaster recovery, on the other hand, is when we do have a major failure, how do we recover and how do we handle that failure? So what to do when we have a failure. Business continuity is mitigating the effects of a failure, and disaster recovery is knowing what to do when we have a disastrous failure. And when I think about business continuity, I like to think of an airplane when I think of business continuity, and you can see in my slide deck here, I've got a picture of a 747. And 747s are and 757s, all of those big airplanes. And I'll use the 757 as an example. The 757 is a large airplane, a rather large airplane that has two engines. It's a wide body jet, but it only has two engines. But the thing about the 757 is with two engines, if one engine fails, the other engine can take over and you can still fly the plane. So that is business continuity. It's having redundancy, right? So, and airplanes are a perfect example of redundancy. In a jet, in a large jet airplane, like a Boeing or an Airbus or Embraer or Canadair or whatever, um, almost every system is redundant. Everything is fully redundant. Sometimes there are redundancies to redundancies in airplanes. They put a lot of thought into redundancy in airplanes, so much so that the 757 not only has redundancy in having two engines, but if both engines fail, they even have a contingency for that. There's a little fan that drops down from underneath the airplane, and because when you lose engine power, you no longer have control of any of the the control surfaces on the airplane. So you can't turn, you can't you can't move the rudder, they can't move the elevator, the ailerons, all of that stuff goes away if you don't have power because they're all hydraulically powered. So in order to keep power to those to all of those surfaces, so the pilot can at least control the plane with no engines, they power those from a generator that has a fan that drops out from the airplane. And that fan actually has two purposes. It not only generates electricity and power for all of those hydraulic systems, but it also generates some drag to slow down the airplane because there's no other way to slow it down. Um, so that's a tremendous amount of redundancy. So not only can a 757 fly on just one engine, it could technically fly on zero engines. And you might be saying to yourself, well, okay, maybe it can fly with no engines, but eventually it's going to crash, right? If there's no power. And in fact, that's true. But there are cases where 757s have landed with no engine power, with only hydraulics, and they've been able to land safely. That photograph you see in the bottom right, that was a 757 from Canada. It was a Canada Airlines or Air Canada jet that ran out of fuel at 35,000 feet, and they were able to safely land on a drag strip somewhere. I forget where, but they safely landed on a drag strip because of all of that redundancy. So we use redundancy in IT for the same purpose. We want to try to, well, although it's not usually life and death, although it could be in certain systems. But with business continuity, we want to make sure that we architect systems that are much less likely to fail because of the way that we've architected them. And there's a couple different techniques to do that. So an organization's ability to maintain operations in a disruptive event is business continuity. Examples of events could be power outages, hurricanes, tsunamis, attacks, threats, all of those things that we talk about could all cause some interruption. So we want to have systems that have enough redundancy to be able to work through those threats. One of those techniques we have is called clustering. So, some organizations stockpile spare parts for servers or have redundant servers, which is good. But clustering is combining two or more devices to appear as a single unit. So a server cluster is a combination of two or more servers that are interconnected to appear as one server. So any one of those could fail, or any few of those could fail, and we still have full operations. So servers are connected through public clusters, and they could also be private clusters. And this is just a picture from the reading that I gave you in Blackboard that shows kind of the difference there. But when most people talk about clustering, they think of a public cluster where you have that load balancing switch and clients connect through that, and the traffic is balanced between multiple servers. I've actually talked about this in this course a few times before, so this is not the first time that we've talked about clustering. Also storage. So one of the problems with storage is failure. So hard drives and solid state drives, they all fail periodically. I've talked about that before. I've talked about how there are specifications on storage hardware that tells you what the failure rate is. And I think I jokingly said before that if you look at the warranty, that's usually when it's going to fail, right? When the warranty expires. So you can determine the number of spare hard drives an organization should keep. But one of the ways that we have business continuity is through RAID, and I've talked about RAID before. I figured in this slide deck I would expand on RAID. I feel like I didn't really do this topic justice, so I wanted to kind of give you kind of a visual on how RAID works. And of course, RAID isn't the stuff we use to kill ants. It's a redundant array of independent or inexpensive disks, which we've discussed before in this course. And I think I've talked about before. So RAID 0, but let's pretend we don't have RAID at all. If you just had a single hard drive, you would store the data to a single hard drive, and you can read data from a single hard drive. But if you lose that hard drive, you lose your data, obviously. And RAID 0 is basically where we have multiple hard drives instead of one hard drive. And the way we write to those drives, we write in parallel and we can read in parallel. So the advantage here is it's much faster, right? I can read and write extremely fast, but if I lose any one of those drives, I've lost all of my data because it's useless at that point. Every other bit is missing. Every third bit in this case is missing. So the data is basically trash at this point. I have no idea, what this data should be. Maybe I could guess some of those, but that would be extremely tedious on a large data set. So it's as good as gone if you lose that drive. So RAID 0 gives us lots of speed and performance, but we actually have less redundancy, or we have less availability, I should say, with RAID 0 than we have with even just one drive. So RAID 1 is a step in the right direction for redundancy, but it's a step backwards for performance and speed. It takes a long time to write the data because I have to write to two different drives. Now I can read the data much faster, which is nice. So it's a slow write, but a fast read. But if I lose any one of my drives, I can always rebuild that drive from the mirrored drive. So I do get some good redundancy with RAID 1. However, it's efficient for data storage because for every one hard drive I have for storage, I have to have a second with the same amount of space for redundancy. And the more data I want to store, the more redundancy I have to have, the more extra hard drives I have to have. So it's not very fast for writing. It's very fast for reading, which is great, but I lose efficiency in storage. So a nice happy medium, as I discussed in the previous lecture, is RAID 5, where I can write my data in parallel. The more drives I have, the faster this is going to be. And I always lose one drive for parity, where I calculate that parity bit so that I could always recalculate. If I ever lose a drive, I can recalculate what data should be on that drive. And by the way, I can read much faster as well. The other advantage with RAID 5 is I have a much more efficient way of storing my data because I only ever lose one drive to parity. So if I had 200 gigs that I need to store, I need 3 drives. If I want to store 300, I need 4. For 400, I need 5. For 500, I need 6. And you can see the more drives you have, the less space you're losing to redundancy. So the more drives you have, the more devices, it's actually more efficient. So that's good. But again, if I lose any more than one drive, I still have a failure. So before we talked about RAID 6, which adds another drive for parity, more or less adds another drive for parity. I should clarify, somebody's going to probably email me and say, Brian, that slide's technically wrong. It's actually RAID 3, and that's true. In my visual representation here, it's actually RAID 3. In real RAID 5, the parity is striped across all the drives. So, but it's hard to visualize that. But the concept here is the same between RAID 3 and RAID 5. You lose one drive space's worth of space to parity, even though that parity technically is is across all the drives. And really that's for performance reasons. But RAID 3 is really what you see in the picture here. So as far as networks go, we can do business continuity with networking as well. So redundant networks may be necessary for critical nature of connectivity today. In other words, when networks go down, our infrastructure is down, everything is down. So we need redundant networks sometimes as well. Now we might not have redundant networks in low impact areas like in offices and things of that nature, but maybe in our data centers we should have network redundancy. And most data centers today have, if not redundant networks, multiple redundant networks. So my data center, we have 3 redundant networks that are interconnected. So I can lose 2 networks and I'm still flying, which is pretty good. So they can either wait in the background during normal operations, or they can be an active failover. They can launch automatically in the event of a disaster if it's between different data centers and things like that. You can have multiple links. In other words, in my data center, we don't just have one ISP. We have 3 different ISPs that come into the data center. That way, if we lose an ISP, we're still 100% operational. So if Verizon goes down, I still have Sprint or whatever it is. I forget who the providers are, but I don't pay the bill. But it is awfully expensive, those ISPs. But in any event, if you lose one, you're still able to operate. So you might have redundancy there as well. And then power. Having redundant power. Power is another threat. If the power goes out, I lose access to my servers. So one way to do that is to have uninterruptible power supplies. So an offline UPS is the least expensive and simplest solution. It's charged by a main power supply, and it begins supplying power quickly when the primary power is interrupted, and then it switches back to standby mode when the power is restored. Where online UPS is always running off of the battery, while main power runs the battery charger. So it's like a giant capacitor, and you get some period of time of power if the power ever goes out, but there's no interruption at all. And it can also serve as a surge protector. Most modern UPSs work like that. So if you buy, if you go to the store and you get a UPS, or even if you get one for your data center that's one of those big, 700 VA UPSs or something like that, they typically work like this, where you're actually using power to charge the battery, and the battery's actually running the servers, actually providing the power. That way, if you ever lose the power, there's no disconnect. There's no changeover, right? There's no switching back and forth. The same could be done with generators. So sometimes, there's different types of generators where some generators kick on when the power goes off, but there's a slight interruption in power, which can be mitigated with batteries. And then you have flywheel generators where there's a flywheel that's constantly being powered, so it's constantly spinning. That way, when the generator turns on, there's very little interruption in the power, which is a nice happy medium. So lots of different ways to do that. And then we have site duplication, so business continuity by sites. A hot site, which is sort of the Cadillac of business continuity and redundancy, is where we have a complete duplicate of our production site. It has all the equipment already there. Everything is running. We have everything already in place, and we can switch over to that at any time. A cold site, on the other hand, is really just a big empty room waiting for us to move to that site. It's kind of waiting in the wings. Whereas a warm site is sort of a combination between the two. The textbook definitions are not always adhered to with these concepts. Some people talk about cold sites, but they really are a little bit more than a cold site. Some people talk about warm sites, but it's really more like a cold site. So, but a hot site, without a doubt, a hot site is a fully operational environment that's ready to go at a moment, at any time. You can, and sometimes it's an automatic failover. And of course, cloud changes a lot of this, and we're going to talk about that. How some of this stuff goes away with the cloud. Some of this stuff we're just looking at how our provider does it in the cloud to ensure that it's what we need. So lots of different ways to do this. So finally, let's talk about disaster recovery. So disaster recovery is different from business continuity, because disaster recovery basically means that our business continuity failed, right? Something happened, and now we have a real outage that we have to handle, because and things are going offline, right? It's usually a little bit more impactful than something with business. So business continuity is handling things that happen all the time, right? Power failures can happen anytime. data centers going offline, ISPs going down, all the things that we talked about using redundancy for to mitigate, where a disaster is something that happens that has a severe impact on our operations. So as far as disaster recovery goes, we always want to make sure we have a disaster recovery plan, which is for restoring IT functions and services to its former state. Disaster recovery involves a plan, procedures to address redundancy and fault tolerance, making sure you have data backups so that you can always get to that recovery point. So a disaster recovery plan is a written document detailing the process for restoring IT services following some disruptive event. They're very comprehensive in scope. They're very detailed. They're updated regularly. If I could give you any advice about a DRP, the reason that we have DRPs is, when I was a kid, I worked as a lifeguard, and I remember when I was training to be a lifeguard, they told us that if somebody was drowning, and I used to work as a lifeguard. When I was a lifeguard, I worked on beaches by myself. They would send us out to, some beach somewhere. There's lakes all over the place where I live and where I lived when I was a kid. And you would ride your bike to a lake somewhere, and you'd be the only lifeguard there. And there was a phone at the beach. And I remember they would tell us that if anyone was ever drowning, before you go in the water to get the person that was drowning or to do the save, more or less, they would tell us to point to someone specifically and say, "You go call 911." And there was a script next to the phone that would tell them what to say to 911. So they would pick up the phone, dial 911, and they would read this little script that said, "I'm at such and such lake, which is located at such and such, whatever." But the reason they said that is if you just say to a crowd of people, "Someone go call 911," everyone stands around looking at each other thinking somebody else is going to go do it. Not because they're bad people, it's just human nature. Everybody wants to see what's going on, and people are reluctant to go do it. And for whatever psychological reason, nobody goes and calls 911. But if you specifically tell someone what to do, you point at somebody and say, "Your job is to go call 911 and you have to do this," you're making it their responsibility. They go into autopilot and they just do it, right? They just follow those instructions and they do what they're told. In my life as a lifeguard, I only ever had to do that twice. And both times I pointed at whoever it didn't matter. I just pointed at somebody and say, "You go call 911." They ran right off and went and called 911. And by the time I got out of the water, there was already police officers there to help me. And of course, with near drowning, you always send people to the hospital, so it's not like you would tell them to go away. But in any event, if you don't have a plan, if you don't have some kind of written plan, if people don't know what to do in a disaster, they're going to run around like chickens with their heads cut off. There's not going to be any organization. There's going to be no plan. And at the end of the day, things may recover eventually, right? You're going to get there one way or the other, but it's going to take an awful lot longer if you don't have that plan. The plan also allows you to test whether or not what you think you're going to do in a disaster is going to work. If you have a plan, you can test that plan. You can simulate and test that plan. You could do desk checks to simulate the plan. You can do simulations. You can do real downtime tests and real drills. But you have a plan that you can follow. You can figure out what worked and what didn't work and make sure you have the most effective plan to restore operations in the event of a disaster. You could take whole courses on business continuity and disaster recovery planning, especially disaster recovery planning. It's a pretty large subject. So in this first slide deck, my goal here was to familiarize you with IT security concepts. You may have taken other classes where you discuss many of these concepts, but my goal here was to level set on these general IT security concepts, which as we go forward in this course, we're going to apply all of these to the cloud and understand how they apply to the cloud and some special concerns in the cloud. In the other presentation in this unit, I'm going to talk about some specific security technologies. So here I talked about security vernacular and concepts. In the next slide deck, I'm going to talk about security tools and technologies that are available to us, like encryption and things like that.